Okay, so let's say you wake up one morning and your cup of coffee has gone up like 15% in price.
Oh, wow.
Or that new car that you've been saving up for is suddenly thousands of dollars more expensive.
Yikes.
That could be the world we're heading towards if this whole U.S.-Canada trade war keeps heating up.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
Welcome to Dansplain. I'm Edward.
And I'm Lily.
And today we are going deep into this trade war between the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah, we're going to try to figure out, how we even got here.
Yeah, how did this all start?
Where things are headed and what it all means for both countries.
And what it means for, regular people like us.
Exactly. What's it going to do to our wallets?
Yeah, because that's really what people care about at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
So to get us started, we've got a bunch of research here, like reports from the Bank of Canada analyses, from the Fraser Institute, and even some historical context from sources like the Canadian Encyclopedia.
Yeah, we really wanted to cover all the bases and give you a clear picture of what's going on.
Okay, so to kick things off, can you give us a quick snapshot of where we are right now with all these tariffs flying around?
Yeah, so things got pretty intense back in February of 2025 when the U.S. slapped a 25% tariff on most stuff that Canada was sending over.
Whoa, 25% across the board.
Pretty much. And then Canada hit back with their own 25% tariffs on about $30 billion worth of American products.
Wow, a tit-for-tat tariff war.
Yeah, you could say that.
So what kind of impact are these tariffs actually having, out in the real world?
Well, you're probably already seeing it at the grocery store. Prices are going up on everything.
Yeah, for sure.
On orange juice and peanut butter.
Oh, no, not the peanut butter.
Yeah, I know, to industrial stuff, machinery parts, you name it.
So it's not just hitting consumers, it's also impacting businesses.
Yeah, and it's hitting businesses on both sides of the border.
Right, it's not like a one-way street.
Exactly, and that's why the Bank of Canada is warning that these tariffs could actually wipe out all the projected economic growth for both countries.
No, seriously.
Yeah, for the next 2 years.
That's a huge blow.
And on top of that, there's this real risk of inflation spiking as those import costs keep rising.
Yeah, it's kind of a double whammy.
Yeah, definitely.
It's interesting you mentioned the risk to both economies because it seems like in a trade war, nobody really wins, right?
Exactly. It's this common misconception that one side can come out on top.
Yeah, you always hear about winning a trade war, but it seems like everyone loses.
It's more like everyone gets hurt to varying degrees.
Right.
The U.S. and Canada have this really complex web of interconnected industries,
Like a delicate ecosystem?
Yeah, and these tariffs disrupt that flow. It's like throwing a wrench into the gears.
And creating economic pain on both sides.
Exactly.
It's interesting. This is the first time the U.S. and Canada have kind of butted heads over trade, right?
Oh, for sure. It's a pattern that goes back over a century.
Wow, really?
Back in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was constant back and forth with tariffs.
Almost like siblings fighting over toys.
Kind of, but with much, much higher stakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So is there a particular historical example that really jumps out as being relevant to what's happening now?
One that comes to mind is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
This is back in 1930 in the U.S., and it basically jacked up tariffs on tons of imported goods, something like over 20,000 different items.
It's a lot of tariffs.
Yeah, and the idea was to protect American businesses, kind of like what we're seeing now.
Right, America first.
But a lot of economists think that it actually made the Great Depression even worse.
Oh, wow. So it backfired.
Big time, because it basically choked global trade, and then other countries retaliated with their own tariffs.
Oh, it was kind of like a global trade war.
Yeah, exactly. It was a mess.
So are we in danger of repeating history with these current tariffs?
It's definitely a concern. Smoot-Hawley is a stark reminder of how protectionist policies can go wrong.
Yeah, it's a cautionary tale.
Thankfully, things did calm down a bit after World War II.
Right.
With agreements like NAFTA.
NAFTA was huge.
It was a game changer. It really lowered trade barriers between the U.S. and Canada.
And it seemed like it ushered in this new era of cooperation.
It did for a while, but then in recent years, we've seen this resurgence of that protectionist mindset.
Yeah, especially with the current U.S. administration.
Right. It feels like we're kind of going back in time.
It makes you wonder what would happen if we just got rid of all trade barriers altogether.
Oh, wow.
What if there were zero obstacles to trade between the U.S. and Canada?
That's a big question.
Would it be like this utopia of low prices and economic growth?
It sounds good in theory.
Or are there some hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface?
Economists have actually spent a lot of time modeling this kind of scenario.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and what they've found is that the reality of zero trade barriers is pretty nuanced.
Okay, so it's not a simple answer.
Not at all. There'd be some big benefits,
Okay, I'm intrigued.
but also some serious risks, especially for Canada.
Oh, okay, so let's start with the potential upside. What are the main benefits that Canada might see if all these trade barriers magically vanished?
Well, first off, consumers would see prices drop significantly.
Like, how much are we talking?
Potentially like 5 to 15% lower prices on everything.
Wow, that's significant.
From groceries and clothing to electronics and cars.
So basically everything would be cheaper.
Pretty much.
That would be great for the average Canadian.
It would mean more money in their pockets to spend on other things, which would then boost the overall economy.
Right, it's a ripple effect.
Exactly. And economists have even estimated that zero trade barriers could increase Canada's GDP by like 0.5% to 1% every year.
That's pretty significant.
Yeah, it would be driven by increased efficiency, better supply chains, and Canadian businesses being able to specialize in things they're really good at.
So lower prices, a boost to GDP. It sounds like a win-win situation.
On the surface, yes.
But there's a catch, right?
There is, and it's a big one.
Okay, hit me with it.
Removing all trade barriers could actually lead to the collapse of certain protected industries in Canada.
Like which ones?
Especially the dairy industry.
Oh, yeah. Canadian dairy is a big deal.
It is. And right now they operate under the system called supply management.
Okay, I've heard of that.
It limits imports and controls prices to protect those Canadian dairy farmers.
So it's like a shield.
Exactly. But if you take that shield away, those farmers would face intense competition from huge U.S. producers.
Who can produce milk at a much lower cost.
Exactly. And we're talking about potentially losing like 50 to 70% of their market share.
Wow, that's devastating.
And that translates to thousands of jobs lost not just on farms, but throughout the whole industry.
So it's not just the farmers themselves.
No, it's the whole supply chain, the processing plants, the truck drivers, everyone.
So it's this trade-off, lower prices for consumers, but at the potential cost of jobs and an entire industry.
Yeah, it's a tough pill to swallow.
And it's not just dairy, right?
No other protected sectors like poultry and softwood lumber could also suffer.
So we're potentially talking about a lot of job losses.
Yeah, upwards of 150,000 across various industries, and a lot of those would be in rural areas where these industries are often the backbone of the community.
That's a sobering thought. It seems like Canada faces some unique challenges in this whole trade relationship with the U.S.
Oh, absolutely. Canada's economy is way smaller than the U.S. economy, and it's very reliant on trade with its southern neighbor.
So any big changes in that relationship can have huge consequences for Canada.
Exactly. They're kind of in a vulnerable position.
So how can Canada adapt to these potential changes? Is there any way to make this transition smoother?
Well, we can look to history for some clues.
Like what happened in the past?
After NAFTA was implemented, the Canadian textile industry took a big hit.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
They lost thousands of jobs, but over time, those losses were mostly offset by growth in other sectors, like aerospace.
So they were able to reinvent themselves.
Yeah, in a way, but it took a lot of effort and planning.
So it wasn't just luck.
No, the government had to step in with retraining programs, support for businesses, and investments in infrastructure.
So there's a whole system put in place to help people adapt.
Exactly, and that's what we need now, too. It's not just about tearing down barriers, it's about proactively building something new and sustainable in their place.
Yeah, like creating a more dynamic and resilient economy.
Exactly, one that can adapt to the changing landscape of global trade.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential impact on Canada, but what about the U.S.? Are they just sitting pretty in this scenario?
You know, not necessarily.
Oh, really?
While the U.S. would probably benefit from selling more stuff to Canada in a zero-barrier world,
Yeah, more exports.
there would be some pushback, too.
From who?
Certain industries and labor unions in the U.S. would face more competition from Canadian businesses.
Oh, so they would feel the pinch.
Yeah, and they might start lobbying for protectionist measures.
So it's not as simple as the U.S. wins, Canada loses?
Nope. It's way more complicated than that. And it's important to remember that trade policy is often driven by politics, you know?
Yeah, there's always a political angle.
There would be winners and losers on both sides of the border.
So even with all the potential benefits, achieving completely free trade between Canada and the U.S. seems like a long shot.
It does. The political realities on both sides make it really unlikely, at least in the short term.
All right, so let's take a step back and recap what we've covered so far. We've got this escalating tariff war that's pushing up prices and threatening economic growth for both countries.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mess.
And we've also seen that historically the U.S. and Canada have this kind of love-hate relationship with protectionism. You know,
Back and forth like a pendulum.
Exactly.
And even though a world without any trade barriers might sound good on paper,
It's like a utopian dream.
the potential downsides are pretty significant, especially for Canada.
Yeah, they're walking a tightrope trying to balance the benefits of free trade with protecting their own industries and workers.
It's a tough spot to be in.
It sounds like there were no easy answers here.
Nope, it's a complex issue with a lot of moving parts.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful. Willie, thanks for breaking down this complex landscape for us.
My pleasure, Edward. Happy to help.
And for our listeners, if you want to learn more about this trade war, explore potential solutions, or delve into other fascinating topics, head over to www.dansplain.xyz.
You'll find tons of great articles, bonus content, and much more.
We'll also be back soon with another deep dive where we'll explore strategies for navigating this changing economic landscape and discuss how individuals and businesses can position themselves for success.
Yeah, it's all about being prepared.
Until then, keep those thinking caps on, and we'll see you next time.
See you later. It really is a tough situation, and it makes you wonder, what should Canada even do?
Right? Like, what are their options here? Because doing nothing doesn't seem like a good plan.
Well, one idea is to maybe try a phased approach to reducing these trade barriers.
Okay, so instead of just going straight to zero barriers overnight.
Yeah, because we've talked about how risky that would be, so maybe a more gradual approach would make sense.
So kind of like easing into it instead of jumping in the deep end.
Exactly, and this could involve picking specific sectors where Canada's already strong and gradually reducing barriers there first.
Okay, so what kind of sectors are we talking about?
Well, Canada's got a good reputation in tech, renewable energy, professional services.
Yeah, those are all growing industries.
They are, and they could probably compete really well in the U.S. market even without tariffs.
Yeah, that makes sense. But even with a phased approach, won't there still be some industries and workers who get left behind?
There probably will be, and that's where government support is so important.
So, like, what kind of support are we talking about?
Things like retraining programs, helping businesses transition to new markets, investing in infrastructure that makes trade easier.
So it's not just about removing barriers. It's about creating a whole system to support those who might be negatively impacted.
Exactly. It's got to be a holistic approach. You can't just focus on the economics. You have to consider the social and political impacts, too.
Right. It's about people's lives at the end of it.
Exactly.
This all sounds good in theory, but are there any real-world examples of countries actually pulling this off?
There are. Look at the European Union after they created the single market.
The EU, yeah.
There were definitely some challenges and some sectors struggled.
Sure.
But overall, that free movement of goods, services, and people has been a big driver of economic growth for those countries.
So the EU is like a potential model for how to do this right.
It is. It shows that even though there will always be winners and losers in any big economic shift, with the right planning and support, you can create a system where the benefits outweigh the costs.
It makes you wonder what's going to happen with U.S.-Canada trade relations in the long run. Is this protectionist stuff just a temporary thing, or are we heading towards a whole new era of trade friction?
That's the million-dollar question. It's hard to say for sure, but one thing's for sure, the landscape of global trade is getting more complex and uncertain.
Yeah, there are a lot of factors at play.
Like the rise of new economic powers, technology, changing rapidly concerns about sustainability and social responsibility.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It is, and it means countries like Canada are going to have to be nimble and adaptable if they want to thrive.
So what do they need to do to stay ahead of the curve?
Well, they need to diversify their economies, invest in innovation, develop a skilled workforce that can compete globally.
Yeah, those all sound like good ideas.
And they need to be smart about trade negotiations, finding ways to work with partners, but also standing up for their own interests.
So it's a balancing act.
It is a delicate one.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about, Lily. It's clear that this whole trade thing is way more complicated than it seems on the surface.
It is. There's a lot going on beneath the surface.
And understanding both the economics and the politics is crucial.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us, Lily.
My pleasure. Edward, always happy to chat about this stuff.
And for our listeners, if you're looking for more in-depth analysis, insightful commentary, or just want to make sense of this crazy world, be sure to visit www.xweo.dansplain.xyz.
We've got articles, podcasts, videos, and a whole lot more to keep you informed.
And be sure to tune in to our next episode, where we'll explore some specific strategies for navigating this changing landscape of global trade.
We'll give you some practical tips and advice to help you stay ahead of the game.
Until then, stay curious, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it really is amazing how much is going on behind the scenes, like you said, with something as simple as the price of a cup of coffee or a new car.
Yeah, you don't really think about it until it hits your wallet.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Lily, you've given us a lot to think about today. This whole trade war situation, the history of protectionism, the potential upsides and downsides of free trade. It's a lot to process.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack for sure.
So what's like one key takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with today?
That's a good question. I think the most important thing to remember is that there's no magic bullet when it comes to trade policy.
You know,
I
like
think.
no easy answers.
Right. It's all about finding that sweet spot between being open to trade and protecting your own interests, between growing the economy and making sure workers and industries aren't left behind.
It's a delicate balance.
It is. And that balance is probably going to keep shifting as the world changes, you know?
So being flexible is key.
Absolutely. This isn't the time to be stuck in your ways or clinging to the past.
It's time to be creative and adaptable.
Exactly. Think outside the box. Be willing to try new things.
Well said, Lily. Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive. Thanks again for joining us on Dansplain and sharing your expertise.
My pleasure, Edward. I always enjoy these conversations.
And for our listeners, if you're looking to learn more about trade economics, global affairs, all that good stuff, be sure to visit us at www.dansplain.xyz.
We've got tons of resources there, articles, podcasts, videos, you name it.
We'll also be back soon with another episode of Dansplain where we'll keep exploring the forces shaping our world and hopefully give you the knowledge you need to navigate these complex times.
Yeah, we'll keep digging into these important topics.
Until then, stay curious, keep learning, and keep those thinking caps on.
See ya.